Imagine a profound stillness, not silence, but a stillness. Dense, heavy, like a lead blanket covering an endless, snow-covered forest somewhere near Gef in December of 1941. The air, frigid and sharp like shattered glass, stands motionless. Every snowflake descending upon the ancient firs seems to emit a barely audible chime. And in the middle of this white, dead ocean, frozen into a snowdrift up to its belly, stands something that should not be here. The dark green, predatory fuselage of an Il-2 attack plane, stripped of its wings, resembling a gigantic metal larva. From it, like two umbilical cords, stretch harnesses woven from parachute lines and belts, and in these harnesses, yoked like a pair of oxen to an impossible plow, stand two men. Their figures have almost lost their human shape, transformed into frozen statues of grime, soot, and exhaustion. Their faces, overgrown with icy stubble, are covered in a crust of frost. Their eyes, sunken deep, stare at a single point, the unending snow ahead. This is the 15th day of their odyssey. Lieutenant Alexei Orlov, the pilot, and Sergeant Dmitry Zubov, the gunner radio man. For 15 days they have been dragging 7 tons of armored metal on their own backs through enemy territory. Their flying tank no longer flew. It had become their beast of burden in a sea of snow. It had become their Golgotha. Right now they are not moving. They are simply standing. And the only sign of life is the faint cloud of vapor escaping from their chapped lips. Inside Orlov, everything has long since burned out. There's no fear, no hope, no despair. There's only a dull, aching pain in every muscle, in every joint, and a cold that has seeped into his very bones, becoming part of his skeleton. He looks at Zubov's back, an equally motionless effigy. He doesn't know what his gunner is thinking. They haven't spoken for many days. All words are frozen, turned into meaningless shards of ice. Their communication has been reduced to 3 commands. Let's go. Stop. One more time. Orlov closes his eyes. Beneath his eyelids is not darkness, but the blinding whiteness of the snow, which has seared his retinas. He tries to remember his wife Anna's face, but it blurs, dissolving into a featureless oval. Memory, too, is freezing. Only one thing remains: the weight. The unbearable, all-consuming weight of the steel beast behind him, which has grown into his shoulders, his spine, his very soul. They have already dragged it for 30, maybe 40 kilometers, about 18 to 25 miles. Every meter was torn from this forest in battle. Every meter cost them drops of blood, sweat, and sanity. At night, Zubov sometimes began to whimper softly in his sleep. Orlov had stopped sleeping. He would just lie inside the cold fuselage, listening to the trees crack from the frost and the beat of his own tired heart. He, the leader, the steel rod who had initiated this madness, no longer fully understood why they were doing it. The initial impulse, the stubbornness, the refusal to lose a 3rd plane in 3 months, all of it had been erased, ground into an icy dust. All that was left was the journey, an endless, senseless journey with a multi-ton burden on their shoulders. He placed a frozen palm on the cold armor of the aircraft. The metal was part of his body. They had fused together. He was the pilot, and this was his plane. And he would haul it to safety, or die here, in this snow, harnessed to his own grave. He opened his eyes. Nothing had changed. The same forest, the same snow, the same back of Zubov. To understand how 2 airmen turned into living winches, how a war machine became their cross, and how a desperate feat turned into slow suicide, we must go back 15 days. To a day when their world was not yet a white stillness, but was filled with the roar of engines, the smell of gasoline, and a hot, fierce hope for victory. November 20th, 1941. A makeshift airfield near Moscow. The world was not yet monochromatic. It was painted in the grim, dirty colors of war. The sodden earth, a mix of the first frosts and thaws, resembled a brown porridge mixed with soot and fuel oil. A low, leaden sky scraped its belly against the tops of the bare birch trees. And amidst this desolation, like tired but formidable predators, stood the Il-2 attack planes. Low-slung, armored, with wing consoles as thick as mammoth tusks. They were called flying tanks, and it was no exaggeration. Lieutenant Alexei Orlov, a 23-year-old man with the eyes of an old man, walked around his aircraft, number 17. He wasn't just inspecting it. He was talking to it. He caressed the cold armor with his palm, peered into the glass eyes of the cockpit, checked every rivet, every seam. To him, this was not just a piece of metal. It was his third Il-2. The first two had burned up under him. One near Yelnya, the other near Vyazma. Both times he had miraculously survived, pulling his gunner from the flames. But he had lost the machines, and each loss was a personal tragedy for him, like the death of a comrade in arms. He, an engineer by pre-war trade, saw something more than a weapon in these machines. He saw in them the pinnacle of human genius, a living organism of steel and wires. And he hated the war for forcing these perfect creations to burn. His gunner, Sergeant Dmitry Zubov, was his complete opposite. A 19-year-old boy from a Saratov village, cheerful and bold on the ground, he transformed into a silent fatalist in the air. He didn't love planes. He feared and respected them the way one fears and respects an unpredictable, powerful beast. His workplace, a small cockpit in the rear, open to all winds, with a single SHKS machine gun, was nicknamed the Death Seat by soldiers. A gunner's chances of survival in an Il-2 during a serious attack was slim. And Dima Zubov understood this perfectly. He sat on an ammunition crate, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and watching his commander. There he goes, coddling his iron lady again, he thought without malice. Treats it like a woman, honest to God. Zubov wanted simple things, to survive, to win, and to go home to his mother. He didn't understand Orlov's complex love for machinery. For him, the plane was a tool, just like a rifle or a shovel. If it broke, they'd issue a new one. Their life was simple and harsh. They lived in dugouts, sleeping on hastily built bunks. They ate from a common pot. They wrote letters home in which they lied that everything was fine, that they would soon return victorious. In the evenings, if there were no sorties, someone would play the accordion, someone would mend a bullet-riddled boot, and someone would just silently stare at the fire in the small potbelly stove. Orlov rarely wrote letters. He drew diagrams in his notebook, made calculations, trying to figure out how to improve the gunner's protection or squeeze a little more thrust out of the engine. He lived and breathed the airplane. On that day, the air smelled of anxiety. The first real winter had arrived. Snow had fallen during the night, and now the airfield was covered in a thin white shroud. The Germans were just a few dozen kilometers from Moscow. Every day was like the last. Heavy, bloody battles in the air. They strafed German columns, bombed airfields, fought with messers. Not everyone returned. The empty bunks in the dugout were a silent reminder of the fragility of their lives. "Lieutenant," Zubov called out, finishing his cigarette. "The mechanic said the oil in the reduction gear is leaking again. Says we can fly, but..." Orlov, without turning, replied, "I know. I've already looked. The gasket needs replacing and we don't have any. It'll get us to Moscow." There was absolute confidence in his voice. He believed in his machine. He knew it down to the last screw. He felt it as if it were his own body. This faith and this knowledge were his armor, far more reliable than the steel plates that protected his cockpit. In the evening, the order came. At dawn, their squadron was to strike a concentration of German equipment near the village of Kryukovo. It was one of the key sectors in the defense of the capital. Everyone understood the flight would be a hot one. According to intelligence reports, the Germans had concentrated powerful anti-aircraft artillery there. Before sleep, Orlov, as usual, sat over his drawings. Zubov, lying on his bunk, was writing a letter to his mother. He wrote about the snow, that the food was good, and about his commander, who was strict but fair. He didn't write about how terrifying it was to see the black crosses of the Messerschmitts in the sky. He didn't write about his comrades screaming in the flames. He didn't write that he didn't know if he would ever see her again. He finished the letter, folded it into a triangle, and put it in the pocket of his tunic. He didn't know that this letter would never be sent. That evening, he did not yet suspect that within 24 hours, his world would shrink to the size of a frozen forest, and his main enemy would not be a German ace, but his own despair and the insane will of his commander, who would decide to challenge nature itself. The dawn of November 21st was cold and crimson, like a wound on the body of the sky. The frost was hardening. The ground, which had been a muddy slush just yesterday, now rang like cast iron under their boots. The engines of the attack planes warmed up with a heavy, strained cough, spewing clouds of bluish smoke. Alexei Orlov was already in his cockpit, his gloved hands resting familiarly on the control stick. He felt a slight tremor running through the aircraft's frame. It wasn't a tremor of fear. It was a tremor of impatience, like a thoroughbred horse before a race. He was calm. The entire chaos of the outside world, all the mud and blood of war, remained on the ground. In the sky, there was only him, his machine, and the pure, cold space, where everything was decided by skill and luck. Dmitry Zubov, climbing into his seat behind the pilot, shivered from the piercing wind. His cockpit was open and the icy air burned his face. He checked the machine gun, adjusted the radio. His movements had the practiced ease of years, but a cold, sticky fear stirred in his soul. He glanced at his commander's broad back, at his head in its leather helmet, sitting confidently on his shoulders. That confidence was somewhat calming. As long as Orlov was calm, everything would be all right. 17, ready for takeoff. Orlov's voice crackled in his headset. Ready, Zubov answered curtly, his heart skipping a beat. The roar of the engine grew into a deafening howl. The plane shuddered and, lurching heavily over the frozen bumps, began its takeoff run. The ground rushed by faster and faster, and then, with a final, powerful effort, their flying tank broke free from the sinful earth and soared into the crimson sky. They flew at treetop level, almost brushing the tops of the trees to avoid being detected by German radar. Below, a dreary black and white landscape drifted by. Snow-covered fields, dark patches of forests, frozen threads of rivers. The war had erased all color from this land. After 20 minutes of flight, they saw the target. A German column stretched out for several kilometers, a few miles, along the road leading to Moscow. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks with infantry. From above, they looked small, almost like toys. But Orlov and Zubov knew the death that each of these little boxes carried. I see the target, attacking. Orlov's voice was as hard as steel. The squadron reformed into battle formation, and then the ground beneath them came alive. Dozens of fiery tracers shot up to meet them. The German anti-aircraft artillery had opened up. The sky around them erupted in black and white puffs of flak. The plane was tossed from side to side like a wood chip in a storm. Orlov, gripping the control stick, guided the machine through this fiery hell. He saw only the target. He squeezed the trigger, and fiery streams of rockets erupted from under the wings. The ground below shuddered with explosions. One of the tanks was engulfed in black smoke. Zubov, huddled in his cockpit, fired his machine gun at the trucks, showering them with lead. His headset was filled with an unimaginable crackle and roar, the sound of their own engine, the exploding flak, the shouts of other pilots. And suddenly, an impact, sharp, deafening like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. The entire 7-ton body of the aircraft shuddered. The pilot's cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and wiring. The right engine went silent and tongues of flame burst from under the cowling. "We're hit! We're on fire!" Zubov shouted. "I see it," Orlov replied calmly. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat, but his hands acted on their own automatically. "Jump!" "Commander, My parachute lines are shredded by shrapnel." Zubov's voice was full of despair. Orlov froze for a moment. He couldn't jump alone. Abandoning his gunner was unthinkable. That meant landing, here and now. Below there was only forest, a dense, snow-covered enemy forest. He pushed the stick forward, guiding the burning machine down. The flames were creeping towards the cockpit. The heat was becoming unbearable. "Hang on, Dima!" he rasped into the microphone. The ground rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed. He chose a small clearing, if you could call it that, a small patch less overgrown with trees. He lowered the landing gear, hoping it would soften the impact somewhat. The last thing he remembered was a deafening crack, the screech of tearing metal, and the darkness that swallowed his consciousness. He awoke to the cold and a sharp pain in his head. Opening his eyes, he saw a shattered sky peeking through the cracks in the cockpit canopy. The smell of snow and smoke hit his nostrils. He moved. His body ached, but it seemed no bones were broken. With difficulty, he unbuckled his straps and climbed out of the cockpit. Their Il-2 lay on its belly in the middle of the forest, having cut down several young birch trees. The right wing was torn off and lay a few meters away. The landing gear was broken, but most importantly, the fuselage, the armored capsule, was intact. He looked around. Zubov was lying unconscious next to his cockpit. Orlov ran to him, felt for a pulse. Alive. He carefully lifted him, brought him around. The sergeant moaned and opened his eyes. "Commander, are we alive?" he whispered. "Alive," Orlov replied, surveying their prison. "We're behind enemy lines. The plane is wrecked." According to instructions, they were to destroy the aircraft, burn or blow it up so it wouldn't fall into German hands, and make their way to their own lines. Orlov took out the flare gun to ignite the fuel tanks. He looked at his crippled plane, at his faithful comrade-in-arms, which had just saved their lives by taking the full force of the impact. He looked at the whole, undamaged armored shell, and in his mind, still ringing from the crash, an idea was born. An insane, unbelievable, impossible idea. He lowered the flare gun. Zubov, seeing this, asked in surprise, "Commander, what are you doing?" "We have to burn it." Orlov slowly turned to him. A strange, feverish fire burned in his eyes. "No," he said quietly, but firmly. "We're not leaving it." The first few hours after the crash passed in a fog of shock and adrenaline. They checked themselves. Luckily, aside from bruises and scrapes, there were no serious injuries. The emergency supplies, a few cans of stewed meat, hardtack biscuits, a flask of water, and a first aid kit, had also survived. Zubov, having come to his senses, began to act according to regulations. He took the axe from the emergency kit and was about to chop the fuel lines to start a fire. But Orlov stopped him. "Wait," he said. His gaze was fixed in the plane. He walked around it, touching the dents in the armor, peering at the shattered instruments. It was as if he couldn't believe his 17 would never fly again. "Commander, we're deep behind Fritz's lines," Zubov urged him, nervously glancing around. "They could find us any minute. We have to destroy the machine and get out before our tracks are covered." The logic was ironclad. They were tens of kilometers, dozens of miles from the front line. All around was enemy territory. Their only chance was to move quickly and stealthily. The wrecked plane was a deadly anchor. But Orlov wasn't listening. In his head, two men were at war. The experienced officer who knew his orders by heart, and the stubborn engineer who could not accept the loss of his creation. "It's almost intact, Dima," he said, as if not believing it himself. "The engine is shot, a wing is torn off, but the fuselage, the armored shell is whole. This is a flying tank. It can be repaired." Zubov looked at him as if he were insane. "Repaired? Here? In the forest? Are you out of your mind, Lieutenant? What are we going to fix it with, pine cones? We need to leave." The desperation in the sergeant's voice was almost palpable. He wanted to live. He didn't want to die here for a piece of iron, no matter how valuable. An argument began. Heated, desperate. Zubov argued the obvious. The two of them, in a winter forest without tools or food, couldn't even move this behemoth, let alone repair it. It was suicide. Orlov, however, stuck to his guns. This wasn't just a plane. It was a priceless combat unit. It was armor that was needed at the front. To lose it was a crime. But behind these logical arguments lay something else. Something irrational. This was his third machine. He did not have the right to lose this one too. It was a matter of his personal honor, his war within the Great War. The argument escalated to shouting. Zubov, pushed to his limit, was almost crying with helplessness and fear. Don't you get it? We'll die here. We'll freeze, we'll starve, or we'll run into a German patrol. This plane is our coffin. Orlov looked at him in silence. Then his gaze turned cold and hard. He was the commander, and he had made a decision. Sergeant Zubov, he said in an icy tone that sent a shiver down Dmitri's spine. The order was to destroy the aircraft if evacuation is impossible. I believe evacuation is possible. What evacuation? Zubov howled. Are we going to drag it on our backs? And at that moment, looking into the despairing eyes of his gunner, Orlov realized that was exactly what they were going to do. He didn't know how. He didn't know if they had the strength, but he knew there was no other way for him. Yes, he snapped. We will drag it. A heavy, oppressive silence fell. Zubov stared at his commander and his eyes reflected sheer terror. He realized Orlov wasn't joking. He realized his commander had gone mad. This was the beginning of their personal hell, their private war against the forest, the snow, the frost, and common sense. The first thing Orlov did, like a true engineer, was to take inventory. He made Zubov, who now obeyed purely mechanically like an automaton, pull everything useful out of the plane. Parachutes, belts, tools from the emergency kit, the remaining food, the flare gun, their pistols. Then he began the main task, dismantling. They had to lighten the structure as much as possible. The main problem was the intact left wing and the tail assembly. They created enormous drag. For several hours, working in the piercing wind, they unscrewed bolts, chopped through control rods with the axe. Their hands were freezing, their fingers disobedient. But Orlov, possessed by his idea, gave them no rest. By evening, as darkness began to fall, they had succeeded. Before them lay the bare fuselage resembling a giant fish washed ashore. It still looked impossibly heavy. They spent the night inside their plane. The cold was brutal. They each ate a can of stewed meat, and it was their last proper meal for many days to come. Zubov was silent. He had sunk into apathy. He obeyed. But a dull resistance was growing in his soul. He believed they were doomed. Orlov, on the contrary, was agitated. He was sketching diagrams on the frosted glass of the cockpit, muttering something to himself. He was no longer just a pilot. He was an engineer solving the most difficult problem of his life. He understood that the two of them couldn't move 7 tons. He had to devise a system, and he devised one. In the morning, he woke Zubov and showed him his plan. They would use the parachute lines, weave them into strong ropes, make harnesses like for horses, and pull, not lifting but dragging it over the snow. This is madness, was all Zubov could squeeze out. This is our only chance, Orlov replied. And there was such unbending certainty in his voice that even Zubov, for a moment, doubted his own sanity. Maybe it would work? Maybe they really could achieve the impossible? That fragile hope died the same day, when they first tried to move their burden. Orlov's idea was brilliant in its simplicity, and utterly insane in its essence. He decided to turn himself and Zubov into beasts of burden. All morning, with numb fingers, they unraveled the silk canopies of the parachutes into long, strong lines. Then Orlov, recalling all his engineering knowledge of material strength and levers, began to weave a complex system of ropes and harnesses. He created 2 yokes similar to those worn by horses and attached them to the structural elements of the fuselage's nose. Zubov watched this work with grim indifference. He no longer believed in anything. He simply followed orders, conserving his strength and warmth. He thought of his village, of a warm stove, of the smell of fresh bread. These thoughts were the only things that warmed him from within. By noon, the system was ready. 2 harnesses extended from the nose of the plane like the antennae of a giant beetle. "Well, Sergeant," Orlov said, trying to sound cheerful, "it's time. Let's get in harness." They put on the harnesses. The stiff lines dug into their shoulders even through their sheepskin coats. They stood side by side, tensed, and braced their feet in the snow. "1, 2, 3, pull!" Orlov commanded. They threw their entire weight into the harnesses. Their bodies strained to the limit. Muscles screamed in agony. Their faces turned crimson with effort. But the fuselage didn't even budge. It lay in the snow like a rock embedded in the earth. They tried again and again. The result was the same. 7 tons of dead metal mocked their pathetic efforts. Zubov, breathing heavily, untangled himself from the harness and sat down right in the snow. "I told you," he gasped. "It's useless. We can't move it even a centimeter." The despair he had been suppressing all this time burst out. He was ready to give up. But Orlov was not. Defeat only spurred his engineering mind. He could not lose to this metal. He walked around the plane, knocked on it, looked under its belly. "The problem isn't the weight," he muttered. "It's the friction. It's resting on a large surface area. We need to reduce the contact area." He picked up the axe again. The fire of an inventor burned in his eyes. He began to chop down young trees, stripping them of their branches. Zubov watched him with no interest. He thought his commander had finally lost his mind and was now deciding to build a hut. But Orlov wasn't building a hut. He was building runners. He shoved thick, smooth logs under the fuselage, creating a kind of sledge. It was hellish work. They had to dig out the snow, use levers to lift the nose of the machine even slightly. They worked until dark, and by evening 2 smooth, resinous logs lay under the belly of their Il-2. They were utterly exhausted. They ate the last of the hardtack biscuits. They melted snow for water. That night, Zubov again spoke of leaving. "Lieutenant, let's just leave it. Let's go unburdened. We still have a chance. With this hunk of iron, we'll die here." Orlov, not looking at him, replied, "Tomorrow we'll move it. Go to sleep." In the morning, they harnessed themselves again. Orlov rechecked the log runners. Now the fuselage rested on them, and the friction area was minimal. "Come on, Dima, let's go! One more time, with all you've got!" he shouted. They leaned into the harnesses again. They strained. And this time, a miracle happened. With a deafening screech and a groan, the multi-ton machine moved. It crawled a few centimeters through the snow, then a few more. It was a victory. A tiny but oh so important victory over their circumstances. Zubov turned around, stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. They had done it. They had moved the dead airplane. A spark of hope ignited in his soul. Maybe the commander wasn't crazy. Maybe he was a genius. Emboldened by their success, they dragged their burden another few meters until they hit a small hummock. But that didn't matter anymore. The main thing was, the system worked. They could do it. All that day, they dragged their plane. Slowly, meter by meter, centimeter by centimeter. By evening, they had covered about 100 meters, about 330 feet. They fell from exhaustion, but they got up and pulled again. They were soaked in sweat despite the frost. This first small victory gave them something more than 100 meters of progress. It gave them a purpose. It turned an insane idea into a real, achievable task. But they did not yet know that this victory was only the beginning of their long journey into hell. They rejoiced, unaware that fate had already prepared the next, far more terrifying trial for them. The forest they were crossing was not a level park. It was full of ravines, streams, and impenetrable windfalls, and every new depression, every new hill, became an insurmountable wall for them. The initial euphoria from their small victory faded quickly, replaced by a harsh, grueling routine. Their life became an endless cycle, subordinated to a single action: to pull. They would wake at dawn from a cold that pierced to the bone. They breakfasted on a handful of snow. Then they would harness themselves to their cursed yokes and begin their Sisyphean labor. Step. Another step. Their bodies felt like lead, muscles burned with fire, lungs tore from the icy air. They pulled, bracing against the slippery snow, as the fuselage reluctantly scraped along behind them. Then a short rest, during which they would simply collapse into a snowdrift, unable to move. And then, back to pulling. They were no longer airmen, no longer an officer and a sergeant. They had become a single draft mechanism, a two-headed, four-legged creature chained to its steel burden. Their world shrank to a few meters in front of them. The trampled snow, each other's broad backs, and the endless, silent trees that watched their torment with the indifferent calm of eternity. The plane became the center of their universe. It wasn't just cargo. It was their home. At night, they would climb inside, stuffing rags into the holes and cracks. It was not much warmer inside than out, but the armor protected them from the biting wind. It was their fortress. It was their curse. Orlov became completely absorbed in solving engineering problems. Every ravine, every incline became a personal challenge for him. He learned to use a system of levers made from logs to drag the fuselage over fallen trees. He devised complex block and tackle systems from parachute lines to pull it out of deep snowdrifts. He became the true king of this small, two-man state, where the only law was the law of mechanics, and the only goal was forward motion. Zubov, however, retreated into himself. He pulled the harness silently, his teeth clenched. His rebellion had faded, replaced by a dull submission to fate. He stopped arguing, stopped complaining. He just worked, turning into a machine. But at night, while Orlov slept or made his calculations, Dima would take the unsent letter to his mother from his pocket. By the light of a makeshift wick made from a rag and leftover engine oil, he would read it over and over. These lines, written in another, almost forgotten life, were his only connection to the world of men. He would talk to his mother, telling her about how they were dragging the plane, how his legs and back ached. These silent conversations saved him from madness. They created their own civilization. They had their own calendar, notches on the butt of a pistol, their own language consisting of short commands, their own rituals. Every evening, Orlov would meticulously check their traction system, adjusting the harnesses, greasing the runners, and Zubov was in charge of the hearth, building a tiny fire to melt snow. They learned to live in this forest. They learned to recognize animal tracks, to find edible roots under the snow. But their main enemy was not the forest. Their main enemy was hunger. The emergency rations ran out on the third day. Since then, they had been eating whatever they could find. They chewed on pine needles to get some vitamins. Once they got lucky, they found the frozen carcass of a hare caught in a snare, and it was a true feast. But the rest of the time, hunger was their constant companion. It drained their strength, made their bodies weak and disobedient. It clouded their minds, conjuring vivid, tormenting visions of food. But they kept pulling. The 10th day, the 12th, they lost track of time. They moved at a turtle's pace, a kilometer, sometimes 2, a day. They were on the verge of complete exhaustion. And it was at this moment that their growing, well-oiled system broke down. Not a technical failure, but a human one. Their small, harsh world built on the will of one and the obedience of the other began to crumble. A new, far more dangerous rebellion was brewing within their crew. Hunger is a terrible enemy. It doesn't just exhaust the body. It corrodes the soul, burning away everything human, leaving only animal instincts. On the 14th day of their odyssey, this enemy struck. In the morning, they harnessed themselves as usual, but Zubov couldn't do it. He took a few steps and fell to his knees, breathing heavily. "I can't, Commander," he rasped. No strength left. None at all. Orlov walked over to him. He saw how the sergeant's face had grown gaunt, how his nose had sharpened, how his eyes had sunk. He himself was no better, but he was fueled by stubbornness, by his obsession. Zubov had nothing but hunger and despair. "We have to, Dima. We have to keep going," Orlov said, but his voice sounded uncertain. He knew they had reached their limit. That day they made almost no progress. Zubov kept falling. Orlov tried to pull alone, but it was impossible. In the evening, sitting in the cold fuselage, Zubov spoke. His voice was quiet, devoid of emotion. "You're going to kill us, Lieutenant," he said. "You're going to kill us both for this pile of iron. I'm not going any farther. It's better to die here, peacefully, than like this, in a harness, like a dog." This was not a rebellion. It was a statement of fact. The limit had been reached. Orlov was silent. He looked at his hands, thin, black with dirt, with broken nails. He knew Zubov was right. Their strength was gone. A few more days of this hunger, and they simply wouldn't be able to stand up. His iron will, his engineer's logic, had collided with a simple, inexorable truth. The human body is not a machine. It has a breaking point, and that point had been reached. But he could not give up. To abandon the plane now, after coming so far, was unthinkable for him. It would mean admitting that all their suffering had been in vain, that he, Orlov, had made a monstrous mistake that had cost them their lives. He had to think of something, and he did. The next day he left Zubov in the plane and, taking his pistol, went into the forest. "I'll find food," he said as he left. He wandered through the forest for several hours, staggering with weakness. He looked for tracks, listened for every rustle. But the forest was dead. He was almost in despair when he saw it. An elk. A huge, majestic forest giant stood a few dozen meters away from him, gnawing bark from an aspen tree. Orlov's heart began to pound. This was their chance. A single shot from his pistol could only wound and enrage the beast. He had to get closer. He began to creep forward, hiding behind trees. But his weakened body betrayed him. He stepped on a dry branch. The snap echoed in the quiet forest like a gunshot. The elk raised its head, looked directly at him, and without hurrying, disappeared into the thicket. Orlov was left alone. He sat down in the snow, and for the first time in all this, he cried. With sparse, angry tears of helplessness. He had lost, not to the Germans, not to technology, but to simple hunger. He returned to the plane at dusk, empty and hollowed out. Zubov saw him and understood everything without a word. They sat in silence in the darkness. It seemed this was the end. And then Orlov made a decision, the last, most terrible decision a commander can make. He employed what he would later call, had he ever written his memoirs, surgical cruelty. He took a small chocolate bar from his emergency reserve, which Zubov knew nothing about. He had always saved it for the direst of circumstances. He broke it in half and held one piece out to Zubov. "Eat," he said. Zubov looked at the chocolate, then at Orlov. He understood everything. The commander was sharing his last resort. He was not abandoning him. He was with him to the end. That small piece of sweetness did what no orders or threats could do. It restored Zubov's faith, not in the success of their enterprise, but in his commander. He ate his half, and it seemed to him that he had never tasted anything more delicious in his life. "Thank you, Commander," he whispered. "Tomorrow, we'll continue," Orlov replied just as quietly. The internal enemy had been defeated. Their crew was whole again. But while they were fighting their own despair, the real external enemy was already closing in. The next day, having received a tiny jolt of energy from the chocolate, they were pulling their harness with renewed vigor when they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the steady, strained hum of a German patrol vehicle's engine. The sound was getting closer, a steady, mechanical, alien sound in the silence of the forest. It was coming from somewhere to their right, from the direction of a road they had been carefully avoiding. Orlov and Zubov froze, turning into statues. They were in an open clearing, and their dark fuselage was clearly visible against the white snow. There was nowhere to run. Abandoning the plane was unthinkable. "Quick! Camouflage!" Orlov hissed. Adrenaline shot through their blood, giving them strength they thought they no longer had. They rushed to the nearest fir trees, began breaking off heavy, snow-laden branches and dragging them to the plane. They worked with a feverish, desperate speed. They covered the fuselage with branches, piled snow on it, trying to make it blend in with the surrounding landscape. Their hands bled, their lungs burned, but they didn't stop. The engine's hum grew louder. They could now distinguish the clank of tracks. The Germans were very close. Orlov, having thrown the last branch, grabbed Zubov by the arm and dragged him into the nearby bushes. They fell into a snowdrift, barely managing to hide. A few moments later, a German armored personnel carrier drove into the clearing. About 5 soldiers in white camouflage suits jumped out. They stopped, talking among themselves. One of them, an officer, took out binoculars and began to scan the forest. Orlov's heart sank. He lay pressed into the snow, praying to all the gods he knew and didn't know. He looked at his plane, awkwardly covered with branches. The camouflage was poor. Too poor. Any experienced eye would notice the unnatural outlines. The German officer slowly panned his binoculars along the edge of the forest. His gaze passed over the spot where they were hiding, then slid further. It stopped, peering in the direction of their plane. Orlov stopped breathing. He was already prepared for the worst, his hand fumbling for the grip of his pistol. They would not be taken alive. Those seconds stretched into an eternity. The officer lowered his binoculars, said something to his soldiers. They laughed, got back into the armored carrier. The engine roared, and the vehicle, turning around, drove back towards the road. Orlov and Zubov lay motionless for another 10 minutes, listening to the fading hum. When all was quiet, Orlov exhaled. They were saved. By a miracle. Luck had saved them again. This event shook them to the core. They realized how precarious their situation was. They were not alone in this forest. The enemy was near, and he could appear at any moment. Now they moved with double the caution, trying to stick to the densest parts of the woods, avoiding open spaces. But ahead of them lay the main test, the one that nature itself had prepared for them. On the 18th day of their journey, they came to a river. Not wide, about 50 meters, about 165 feet, but fast-flowing. It had not yet completely frozen over. There was ice along the banks, but dark, cold water flowed in the middle. An obstacle. An insurmountable one. Their journey was over. They stood on the bank, looking at this black ribbon of water, and understood that this was the end of their odyssey. It was impossible to get a multi-ton fuselage across the river. The ice along the edges was too thin. It wouldn't hold. They had nothing to build a bridge with. All their efforts, all their suffering, all 20 days of hell, it was all for nothing. Zubov sat on a fallen log and buried his face in his hands. He wasn't crying. He was simply howling. A quiet, soundless howl, his whole body shaking. It was a cry of final, total defeat. Orlov stood beside him, straight as a rod. His face was like a stone mask. Inside him, everything had collapsed. He, who had found a way out of every situation, who had conquered metal, hunger, and despair, was powerless before this small river. He had lost. And at that moment, in the moment of their deepest despair, they heard a sound again. But it wasn't the hum of an engine. It was the thin, chattering sound of an airplane engine. They raised their heads. High in the sky, circling, was a German reconnaissance plane, a Fuselage, which the soldiers called the Stork, for its angular shape. It was flying slowly, methodically scanning the ground, and they, with their dark plane on the white snow at the edge of the black water, were a perfect target for it. The Stork pilot had undoubtedly already spotted them. Now he would transmit the coordinates, and in a few minutes, attack planes would arrive, or a ground patrol would descend upon them. They had minutes at most. Abandon everything and run? Hide? But where? The surrounding bank was bare and exposed. Orlov looked at the river, at the thin ice near the bank, and in his brain, working with feverish speed, the last, most insane and most brilliant plan was born. It was both their salvation and certain death. He grabbed Zubov, who was still sitting in a stupor. "Dima, listen to me! We have one chance! One! We're going to sink it!" Zubov looked at his commander with crazed eyes. "What? Sink it? Are you insane?" But there was no time for arguments. The German scout, after making another circle, flew off towards its own lines. It had gone to bring back death for them. "We have 10 minutes, no more!" Orlov shouted, already untying the harnesses from the fuselage. "Help me!" Orlov's plan was monstrous in its simplicity. If they couldn't get the plane across the river, they had to hide it. And the best place to hide something in a winter forest is underwater. He decided to sink his Il-2, his dream, his curse, to save it from the enemy and to save themselves. They began to work like madmen. They had to drag the fuselage to the very edge of the water, onto the thin ice. They again used their log levers, their experience gained over these long weeks. They pushed, pulled, straining their last reserves of strength. The fuselage yielded slowly, reluctantly. It crawled towards the river, towards its icy grave. "Come on, one more push! Come on, my beauty," Orlov whispered, addressing the plane as if it were a living thing. He was saying goodbye to it. He was killing the very thing he had saved with such inhuman effort. Finally, the nose of the plane was on the ice. The ice creaked, bending under the weight. It wasn't enough. It had to go under completely. "Push from the side! Rocket!" Orlov commanded. They threw their weight against its side, rocking the multi-ton machine. The ice cracked louder and louder. Long serpentine fissures appeared. One more push. With a deafening crack, the ice gave way, and the nose of the plane plunged underwater. But the tail was still on the bank, and at that moment they heard a growing roar. They were coming back. Orlov looked at the sky. He saw 2 dark dots, German attack planes. "That's it! Run!" he yelled, dragging Zubov with him. They ran a few dozen meters and fell into the snow behind a fallen tree. The German planes, diving, fired a burst from their cannons at the spot where they had just been. Bullets tore through the snow and ice. Then they made another pass. One of the pilots had apparently noticed the tail of the Il-2 sticking out of the water. He dropped a bomb. The explosion sent up a fountain of water, ice, and earth. When the smoke cleared, they saw that the blast wave had pushed the fuselage completely into the water. It sank slowly until only the tip of the tail fin remained above the surface. Then it, too, disappeared into the dark water. The Germans, after circling a bit more, flew away. It was over. Their plane lay at the bottom of the river. Their odyssey was finished. They lay in the snow, empty and completely broken. They had survived, but they had lost everything. They had lost the purpose that had guided them through this hell. Now they were just 2 frozen, hungry men in a foreign forest. Without the plane, they were nothing. Orlov lay with his face in the snow. He felt no joy in his survival, no grief in his loss. He felt nothing. He was empty. For several days, they simply survived. They built a shelter, made a fire, tried to hunt with snares made from wires they had ripped from the plane before sinking it. There was no hope of rescue. They were too weak to go on. They were just waiting for the end. And the end came. But not the one they were expecting. On the 3rd day after the bombing, they heard Russian being spoken in the forest. At first, they thought it was a hallucination. But the voices got closer. It was their own. A ski reconnaissance group. probing the German defenses. When the skiers came upon their camp, they saw two bearded, ragged men who looked more like ghosts. The rescue they no longer expected had come on its own. Their story of how they had dragged their plane through the forest for 20 days and then sunk it was met with shock by the scouts. At first, they didn't believe them. They thought the airmen had lost their minds from the ordeal. They were taken to their own lines. The interrogations by the special department began. The bureaucratic machine of war could not believe their story. It did not fit into any regulations, any conception of what was possible. Where is the plane? We sank it. Why didn't you blow it up? We wanted to save it. Why did you drag it? It was an order. Orlov answered all questions calmly and methodically. He was already beyond fear or hope. If they court-martialed him, so be it. If they shot him, so be it. He had done everything he could. Everything changed when confirmation came from the divers. At the bottom of that very river, they did indeed find the fuselage of an Il-2 attack plane with the board number 17. The story was true. Unbelievable, fantastic, but true. The attitude towards them changed dramatically. From suspects, they became heroes. Their feat became a legend. Orlov was recommended for an order, Zubov for a medal. Their odyssey seemed to have ended in triumph. But for the two of them, it wasn't so simple. Salvation turned into a new prison and victory into a bitter defeat. The system that had first wanted to destroy them now wanted to make them a symbol. But they no longer needed fame or awards. After their story was confirmed, Orlov and Zubov were sent to a hospital. They were treated for frostbite and extreme exhaustion. But the doctors could not cure the fatigue that had settled deep in their souls. They returned to the world of men, but this world seemed alien and incomprehensible. After the harsh, primitive simplicity of their life in the forest, where everything was decided by the laws of physics and survival, the world of orders, regulations, and staff bureaucracy seemed false. Their feat, which for them was just hard, dirty work, had been turned into a beautiful story for army newspapers. Articles were written about them. They were held up as examples. But no one could understand what they had truly been through. No one could feel the weight of the harness on their shoulders, the clammy fear of a German patrol, the despair on the bank of the frozen river. They became heroes, but they remained infinitely alone. Fate brought them together one more time. A few months later, in the spring of 1942, they were summoned to the same airfield from which they had flown their last mission. There, on the runway, stood their Il-2, number 17. It had been raised from the riverbed, taken to a factory and restored. It shone with fresh paint, a red star emblazoned on its side. It was the same plane, their cross and their salvation. The regimental commander, shaking their hands, solemnly announced that they would continue to fight in their rescued machine. To everyone else, it was a symbol of indomitable spirit, of man's victory over circumstances. But for Orlov and Zubov, it was a ghost from the past. They approached the plane. Orlov ran a hand along its side. He no longer felt the connection that had existed between them in the forest. Now, it was just a piece of metal. Cold. Alien. Zubov didn't even touch it. He looked at the gunner's cockpit, and in his eyes was that same icy terror. He couldn't do it anymore. The next day, Sergeant Dmitry Zubov submitted a report requesting a transfer to the infantry. His explanation was simple. I can't fly anymore. The sky is finished for me. His request was granted. He went to the front as a simple foot soldier, and his trail was lost in the bloody meat grinder of the Rzhev battles. He never returned home. He remained lying somewhere there, in the same forest where they had once dragged their plane. Alexei Orlov remained in the Air Force. He fought in his restored 17. He became one of the best attack pilots in the regiment, earning the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He burned dozens of German tanks, but he could never burn away the icy emptiness that had taken root in his soul. He became withdrawn, silent. The other pilots respected him, but they also feared him. It was said that he talked to his plane. He fought through the entire war and saw victory in Berlin. After the war, he worked briefly in a design bureau, but he couldn't stand the quiet of the offices. He left. He moved to Siberia and became a simple forester. He found his peace in that same silence, in the same forest that had once almost become his grave. He never told anyone the details of that 20-day odyssey. In the official documents, his feat was described dryly and briefly. All the pain, all the horror, all the madness remained with him. He died in the 70s, in complete solitude, in his forest warden's hut. He was buried in a small village cemetery. His grave has long been overgrown with grass. But as they say, a story does not end with the death of its heroes. It passes into legend. The official archives of the Ministry of Defense hold only dry lines. Lieutenant Alexei Ivanovich Orlov and Sergeant Dmitry Petrovich, crew of the Il-2 attack aircraft, number 17. On November 21, 1941, they did not return from a combat mission. They were considered missing in action. On December 10th of the same year, they reached their own lines in the defense sector of a neighboring army. For courage shown in the salvation of military equipment, they were recommended for government awards. That's all. A few lines of bureaucratic text. There's not a word in them about the 20 days of hell, about the hunger, about the harnesses digging into their shoulders, about the despair on the riverbank. The soulless machine of war recorded the fact, erasing all emotion, the entire human essence of the feat. Their story, too inconvenient, too unbelievable, not fitting the canons of poster boy heroism, was buried under the secret classification and then simply forgotten. But what dies in archives is often reborn in soldiers' folklore. Among the pilots and technicians of the Western Front, a tale circulated for a long time. The legend of two oddballs who dragged an entire attack plane out of the German rear on their own backs. It was told in smoke breaks, in dugouts, by campfires. With each new storyteller, it acquired new, fantastic details. It was said they survived on nothing but bark and moss, but didn't touch the emergency rations because the plane needs fuel too. It was said a forest spirit helped them, showing them the way. It was said that the pilot was no ordinary man, but was charmed and that he could make a deal with any piece of metal. The story turned into a myth, a parable about Russian stubbornness, about that irrational spiritual strength that cannot be measured by the caliber of guns or tons of armor. This story is not just a chronicle of one incredible event. It is a reminder that the greatest battles of the Second World War took place not only on the battlefields marked on the maps of general staffs, they took place inside the soul of a single, individual man, in his personal confrontation with chaos, despair, and death itself. The story of Alexei Orlov and Dmitry Zubov is a story of how man and machine switched places. The flying tank became an unbearable burden, while two small, fragile men showed the hardness and resilience of the finest armor plate. They didn't just save a plane, they saved something greater within themselves. Loyalty. Loyalty to duty, loyalty to a comrade, and most importantly, loyalty to themselves. And though their names may be forgotten and their graves lost, their silent feet, their 20-day journey through the snow-covered forest, will forever remain inscribed in the invisible chronicle of that great and terrible war. Write in the comments what you think of this story. Can the pilot's act be considered heroism, or was it madness that endangered his comrade's life? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that deserve to be remembered.